crime. It is crime either against society or against the body itself. The body punished by the ignorance or perversion of pressure is very often sickened and rendered incapable of serving the being in the body. The ancient philosophers, working with the problem, decided that whatever the ultimate life principle is, that this may properly be regarded as deity. That behind the forms, personalities, and instruments and bodies of nature, there is one eternal life principle. That this eternal life principle is not only a being, but a being which is inherently occupied and dominated by law. In other words, life and law are identical. Each one is a name for the other, because life, in its own function, follows its own law inevitably. And the moment personal conduct varies from this pattern, there is trouble. In other words, the law or life within us has its own reason for existence. And that reason for existence may not be the same as the personal appetites of the individual. So the philosophers of old like to think of the power in the body as a spirit or a soul, or an energizing power within which is the infinite glory of a divine reality. In other words, the power within the individual is limitless and universal, because it is the presence of a limitless and universal deity. As deity can do as it pleases, deity can change anything it wishes to change. But deity, building up bodies, presents us with the mysterious allegory that we find in the opening chapters of Genesis. The purpose for human existence is a gradual revelation of the being in the body through the body, until the being in the body is completely the governor of conduct, and also gives us the perspectives which provide the incentives for true and eternal growth. Now, if the philosophers and the old theologians were correct, we have therefore within ourselves a mysterious agent that is our share of infinite life. This infinite life, in infinite manifestation, is also infinitely moving within each human being, and is capable of an infinity of manifestations. To understand this, of course, is to be faced with the recognition of the almost I want to get a right word for that now. The infinite opportunity that is locked within the person. Locked within the life itself is a pressure continually striving into manifestation. And this pressure is constantly meeting resistance, so that gradually the body becomes an impairment. It becomes a restriction and a limiting factor. Now, there are all kinds of circumstances that lead to this condition. And here, perhaps, we have some reason for considering the possibility of heredity. Not that man inherits the inner life, but he does sometimes and may frequently inherit the weaknesses or imperfections of the physical body, which belong to his family, his race, or his world at that time. Therefore, the power within is constantly meeting a kind of objection, a pressure from below, a pressure that gradually results in the development of mind as a bridge between the divine and the mortal. Mind is a link. Mind is something that you can educate from below, but must enlighten from above. In other words, the mind can be taught by schooling, by instruction in very many fields. But this instruction is not valuable, actually, unless it contributes to the release of the life factor within the individual. Therefore, education nowadays has become more or less a burden upon the inner life, rather than a means of releasing it. Between the average individual and the releasing of this one divine energy, there stands a mass of modifying, conflicting attitudes, reactions, and instructions. The person is not allowed the simple process of searching for the reality in himself. Now, Western philosophy has largely turned towards industrialized materialism. The individual now assumes that the life within himself is primarily concerned in helping him to become rich, powerful, autocratic, and successful in what we would term materialism. If the mind does not contribute to wealth, the individual feels defeated or underprivileged. And if the life in him begins to complain against what he does to gain wealth, then he turns upon himself and regards himself as a victim of theological superstitions. In other words, anything that interferes with his intention becomes a kind of fallacy, which he tries to place elsewhere and get rid of in order that he can continue his processes of accumulation. Now, we see this very often and very commonly, but to get into the very depth of it, we have to go still further. Actually, in the Orient, there has been a lot of thought given to this problem of the interference of mind and the pressures of materialism with the natural growth of the internal life. The only thing about the human being that is important is a partnership between the life within him and the conduct of his own daily existence. Unless he makes this adjustment, he is going to always have a certain amount of conflict. This was the secret of the alchemical philosophy that flourished during the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries in Europe. It was a problem, actually, of transforming the lower into the use value of the higher. In other words, it was the problem of making the soul itself become flesh in and through the body. If the inner life functions normally and naturally in the body and devotes itself to the reason and expression of its own purposes, the individual will have very little difficulty with the problems of living. The old teachers said that the body, where it is free from opinion and free from the conflicts of lower emotional and mental attitudes, can endure almost indefinitely. And it has even been scientifically recommended that we should hope that in the course of time we will be able to live 150 or 200 years in reasonably good health. The thing that is destroying us is the pressure and conflict between life and ambition, between the energy which sustains us and the misuses of that energy, or the abuses of it, or the corruption of the body so that the energy can no longer function. We will always be in trouble as long as the body is an impairment, as long as it remains as a blocking of the energies of life. And when we can have the body serve life, things work very much better. Now, we also, however, inherit into the body when we are born a whole outside environmental picture of things. We are born into a nation, a race, into a community, into a family. And these pressures move in on us immediately, because none of these institutions are really centered in the divine purpose for things. They are all centered in trying to assure survival in this world. But because the survival here is inconsistent with the purposes of the essential life in man, nothing really succeeds. Everything becomes an endless struggle, trying to prevent mistakes from catching up to us. And if they do catch up, that we will find some way of temporarily neutralizing their effects. We therefore grow into a world which is not the one we belong to. We can't go into all the details, but we can point out, for instance, that in the Orient this has been discovered, has been realized, and it is a known fact, to these people at least, that through quietude and detachment from the causes of death, that the individual is capable of making a creative adjustment with the eternal life within himself. The thing that he has to get rid of is the false appetites and the false decisions made by the mind to serve the ambitions of the body. Now, the body actually, however, is not as bad as we sometimes think it is. It's not really a nasty thing at all. It isn't a wicked thing. It isn't an evil structure. It is something that is simply the instrument of whatever runs it. And if the mind and the emotions become the leaders of the body, they can lead it into destruction. They can destroy its purposes and functions, and in so doing ultimately force its separation from the life principle with which it is intimately associated. With one life in the body, moving from its own secret sources, we must realize that there is only one life in society, also moving towards its natural results and purposes. And instead of living as we do now, with everyone having their own private world, and nations at each other's throats all the time, if we could realize that all nations, all individuals, all planets, and even all cosmic systems are sustained by one energy. This one energy is the common denominator of all that exists. If, therefore, we could once come to serve that energy as it wants to be served, we would end merely all of the conflicts and confusion of mortal existence. But while each individual places himself as a judge of what the inner part of himself decides or demands, he is in trouble. So we have to start a little bit now and just begin to study ourselves. Now, this is a very interesting study, and it is not at all necessarily egocentric. It is not that we are studying it in order to gain some kind of glory. What we are trying to do primarily is to study the compound so that we can become capable of living according to the life principle within us. If we are able to do that, most of the secondary difficulties will fade away. So we have to start by finding out a little bit about the habits of our own thinking. In other words, become observant, thoughtful, or aware of our own functions. Now, the bodily problem is not so serious with most people if they can handle the mental and emotional problems. So when you make a decision, try to understand why you've made it. Face the facts of decisions. Why do you want to do a particular thing? What part of your compound does this action serve? And from what level of your consciousness did the impulse to perform this action basically emerge? You can say to yourself usually that the action is one of self-interest of some kind. It's doing what you want to do, or trying to avoid what you do not want to do. Now, those two problems of avoidance or fulfillment open a way to understanding ourselves in a much more brilliant manner than any educational system can bestow. In other words, each action, each thought, should be weighed in terms of its relationship to a universal good or a personal self-centeredness. The universal is impersonal. The universal is something in which all parts exist to serve the totality.